In this presentation, we will compare governmental accounting versus not-for-profit accounting. First question you might have is, aren't they the same thing? Because oftentimes we see these things grouped together. If we see a course in governmental accounting, we typically see governmental accounting, not-for-profit accounting grouped together. And the answer to that is that it depends. When we think about the governmental and not-for-profit and we compare that to the grouping of the for-profit, that's just going to be one format that we can group information together. It's just like grouping anything else together. It's the same kind of idea as grouping something like a cat to something like a tiger. We might say, well, they're both in the category of cats, but if we wanted to study one or the other or group them into one course of study, we would probably want to separate the two because there's enough distinction between them at this point in time that we would want to focus in on them individually. At one point in time, they were probably much the same and we could study them together without any type of problem. The same is going to be true with different formats and different specializations within business, within accounting. At one point in time, all of accounting was basically covered by the double entry accounting system. That's it. As time passes, then more specialization happens, such as governmental accounting breaking off and basically being a subfield that we have to think about separately because there's enough difference to do so. And then we have the governmental and not-for-profit, which at this point in time, that's a lot of information. So we probably want to break those two out and think of them separately. Want to point that out here for a few different reasons. One, of course, is just so that we have them distinct in our mind, so we know what these groupings mean and how we want to approach them and study them. Two, we want to know what we're thinking about when we want to understand a certain concept. So in other words, if you're here for something like a not-for-profit and you run something like a small not-for-profit type of organization, then you might be overwhelmed if you start thinking about and comparing to governmental accounting, which is going to use fund accounting. We may not need fund accounting, although some of the not-for-profit type concepts might apply to other smaller nonprofit types of organizations. So if on the other hand we're studying accounting for some formalized study such as a CPA exam, then we typically end up grouping the not-for-profits and profits together and concentrate a lot of our time on the governmental accounting because that's often the one that's going to have the most regulations and oftentimes most complexities, therefore including things like fund accounting. If we're a small not-for-profit organizations, then many times we can think about some of the concepts and the objectives of the accounting being similar, but oftentimes many of the concepts such as fund accounting may not be applicable to the not-for-profit organizations, and it might be a little bit overwhelming to consider all the rules for governmental accounting when we're thinking about a not-for-profit accounting. We'll take a look at that in a bit more detail shortly. First, we want to look at how these things are going to be similar, why we have grouped them together, not-for-profits and governmental accounting. One way we can think about these groupings and subgroups of accounting is to consider governmental accounting compared to for-profit accounting. In other words, if we think about accounting fields in general and how they have developed, the accounting double entry accounting system would be applied to all types of organizations. And then at some point in time, as things grow, as more regulations happen, we break out and consider, because of different objectives, the government and not-for-profits breaking out separately from the for-profits. So we have the for-profits now being substantially distinct, then the not-for-profit to the point where we consider them two different areas. We're going to consider them two different fields of study to some degree. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap, and then there's going to be some differences given the changes that have taken place. What then is the root cause or the key component that defines the changes between a for-profit organization and accounting for it and the government and non-for-profit? Basically stems from this concept. The for-profit organization, the owners, which we would think of as stockholders if it's a corporation, expect a return on investment proportional to resources provided. In other words, if we're the owner of an organization, we're putting our time, our money into that organization, and we expect to get a return, direct return on what we have put into that organization, and therefore we are going to be regulating that. We're going to be making sure that we measure the performance of the organization to see that we are getting a return. That means that the stockholders of the organization are really the primary people that check whether or not that organization is achieving their objectives because they expect to have that market pressure, that market return on the investment that they have put into the organization. Both government and not-for-profit organizations are financed by providers who do not expect benefits proportional to the resources they provide. So in other words, if we think about an government type of organization, they're going to get resources in terms of tax dollars in order to pay for necessary things, but the people paying in the tax dollars aren't looking for a direct return. They're not expecting a direct return in the same type of way that you'll have that direct return with a for-profit type of organization. Therefore, the oversight is a little bit more difficult to see because the people that are putting the money in are not regulating in the same way that you would think that would happen for a for-profit organization, because you don't have that direct return type of relationship. The same thing happens with a charitable organization. We put money into a charitable organization, say for medical resources or care of some way, or a church or something like that. They take those resources and use it towards some type of goal. However, that goal isn't a direct return to the people that are giving the money into the organization, and therefore the oversight that the people would typically have in a for-profit organization. In other words, in a for-profit organization, we're going to monitor very closely the performance, how management is doing, because we expect that direct return. When we don't expect that direct return, there's less monitoring. When we donate to a charity, we may not spend as much of our time determining whether or not there's a return that's not going directly to us, but to other people. And therefore, the accounting for the organization needs to be in some ways more transparent. It's actually more difficult in some ways because we don't have that market pressure that we would have in the for-profit organization. The other way we can group the government and not-for-profit organizations together and compare and contrast them to a for-profit organization is through the tax code. We can basically say, well, the for-profit organization is going to be subject to taxation. The profits are going to be subject to taxation. The government and not-for-profit organization then are often exempt from taxes. So that's going to be another way that we can define government and not-for-profit being grouped together as opposed to for-profit, the for-profit being subject to taxes, not-for-profit oftentimes not being subject to taxes. Obviously, if we're thinking about something like the government, they're not going to tax themselves. It would be kind of redundant to tax themselves. We tax other organizations. The tax is the revenue to the government. That's not going to be something that they typically pay if they're going to be the receiver. So that's one way we can consider that. One way we can define a not-for-profit organization, something like a charity, is to simply say that they qualify for tax exemption in some way. In some way, they're not going to be paying the tax in the same way as a for-profit type of organization because they qualify under the tax code for some type of exemption. That's another way that we can define and group not-for-profit and governmental together as compared and composed to the for-profit organization. Now let's take a look at some of the regulations as we compare them to our three basic categories that we have. We've got the for-profit organizations, we have the not-for-profit organizations, and we have the governmental types of organizations. And this is going to be the types of regulations that we have. We have the FASB, which is the Financial Accounting Standards Board. Note that for-profits are going to be subject to FASB, government is subject to FASB, as well as not-for-profit. And you can think of this as being similar to the way accounting has basically grown up, how it has evolved. In essence, it being applied to all types of organizations. That's where the basic accounting principles start. Then the regulation happens with FASB as it applies it to standard accounting, typically concerned with for-profit type of organizations, but also applying double entry accounting to governmental and not-for-profit. And then as things evolved, so do the regulations, right? So then we have GASB, Governmental Accounting Standards, and this is going to be where we can think of the evolution happening, and we say, okay, we've realized that there's some areas that the FASB, normal accounting, has different concepts that are necessary, and therefore different regulations that are necessary. GASB then is going to be an added type of regulation to fill in those places where the FASB isn't adequate for governmental accounting. And then we have the FASAB, which is the Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board, and then it applies to the federal government and its agencies and departments. So you can see here that even if we compare the not-for-profit to the governmental type of organizations, the governmental type of organizations have a lot more regulations that we have to comply with. And therefore, as these things grow, we want to probably break out the not-for-profit and think of them even separately as the governmental type of organizations, given the fact that we're going to have a lot more to deal with as the governmental organizations apply these different types of regulations. One of the major differences between the not-for-profit organization and governmental organizations is that it's less likely that the not-for-profit organization will have to apply full fund accounting, although they might have other things that they must do to track things differently than a for-profit types of organization. The governmental accounting is more likely to use full fund accounting, which is going to be a system that it can be a bit complex.